First story: the house on Ravens Hill. When we first moved into the house on Ravens Hill, I was already uneasy. It wasn't the physical structure that gave me pause. No, it was the sheer weight of the place. Something in the air, something intangible, something older than the house itself. The walls seemed to breathe, the floorboards groaned with age, and the shadows, they seemed to stretch a little too far. It was like the house was waiting for us. I can still picture the day we arrived. The sky was an eerie gray, thick clouds hanging low over the rolling hills of Oregon. The house, tucked away behind a thick line of trees, was surrounded by an unnatural stillness, like it was holding its breath. My wife, Emma, was thrilled. She had always dreamed of living in an old rustic house, and this place was perfect for her, isolated, with room to breathe, away from the chaos of city life. To her, it was a fresh start. But to me, it was a graveyard waiting to be filled. The house was old, that much was obvious. The wood creaked and moaned with every step, and the air inside was thick with dust and memories of people who had long since left. We moved in quickly, eager to settle into our new life. The first night, we slept soundly, or at least Emma did. I, on the other hand, lay awake for hours, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, listening to the wind howling outside. It wasn't until the second night that I noticed something was wrong. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional crack of wood or the soft thud of something heavy shifting in the walls. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. At first, I told myself it was just the house settling. After all, it was old, right? But when I heard the soft, hollow thuds coming from the hallway outside our bedroom, my stomach twisted. I sat up, heart racing. Emma, oblivious to my growing terror, was fast asleep beside me. I pulled the covers up to my chin, straining my ears, but the noise had stopped. The house was still, too still. I lay back down, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but as the hours passed, the unease only grew. And then, just as I was about to drift into an uneasy sleep, I heard it. A voice, barely a whisper, calling my name. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't Emma's voice. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was soft, like the sound of wind through dead branches, but it was there, unmistakable. John? I jolted upright, but the room was still. Emma stirred beside me, but didn't wake. I glanced at the door to our room, the faint glow of moonlight spilling through the cracks, and then I heard it again. The footsteps. Closer this time. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my eyes fixed on the doorway. There, in the faint light, I saw the shadow of something. A figure, tall and thin, standing in the hallway just beyond the doorframe. My heart pounded, and for the first time in my life, I understood what true terror felt like. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed in the dark, before the figure moved. The footsteps grew louder, and I watched in horror as the shadow drifted past the door, vanishing into the darkness of the house. The next morning, I told Emma what had happened. She dismissed it, of course. It was probably just the house settling, or maybe the wind, she said, brushing it off with a laugh. But I knew better. I could still hear the whispers in my head, faint, like an echo of something ancient. The days that followed were filled with more strange occurrences. Objects that weren't where I left them. The air in the house seemed to grow colder, and at night, the whispers became louder, more insistent. At first, I thought I was losing my mind, but then the dream started. Every night, I dreamt of the same thing. A woman, pale and thin, standing at the foot of my bed, staring at me with empty, hollow eyes. She didn't speak, but I could feel her presence, her cold, malicious presence, as though she was waiting for something only I could give her. But it wasn't just the dreams. At night, when I would walk through the halls, I would hear the whispers following me, just behind me, soft and distant, like fingers brushing against my skin. And the footsteps, they never stopped. They were always there, walking behind me, pacing through the empty rooms of the house. One evening, after dinner, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I had to find out what was happening in this cursed place. Emma was out shopping, so I had the house to myself. I ventured down to the basement, drawn by a pull I couldn't explain. The air grew colder as I descended the creaky stairs, the darkness wrapping around me like a cloak. The basement smelled of damp earth and decay, and I could hear the faint dripping of water somewhere in the distance. I scanned the room, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. That's when I saw it. A door, hidden behind a pile of old boxes, a door that hadn't been there before. It was small, unmarked, and appeared far newer than anything else in the basement. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. It was cold to the touch, almost as if it had been waiting for me. I opened it slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. What I found beyond that door still haunts me to this day. A small room, no bigger than a closet, its walls covered in strange symbols and old photographs. The photographs were old, decades old, their edges curled and yellowed. But it wasn't the pictures that caught my attention. It was the symbols, scrawled hastily in what looked like dried blood. I couldn't understand them, but they felt wrong, evil almost. And then I saw her, the woman from my dreams. She was standing in the far corner of the room, her face pale and twisted, her hollow eyes staring right through me. I couldn't breathe. My heart raced in my chest as she took a step toward me, her foot dragging across the dusty floor. Her mouth opened, but instead of speaking, she whispered my name, her voice like nails scraping across a chalkboard. John. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. She was closer now, so close I could feel the coldness radiating off her. And then, before I could react, she reached out and grabbed me by the throat. Her fingers were ice cold, her grip like steel. The last thing I remember was her smile, twisted, grotesque, and full of malice. Her eyes were wide, empty, and as I stared into them, I felt myself being pulled into something dark, something irreversible. I woke up hours later, lying on the cold basement floor. My throat burned, but there was no sign of the woman, no sign of anything. The room was empty, save for the photographs and symbols, but I knew what had happened. I knew what I had seen. The house had claimed me. When I went upstairs, Emma was waiting. She smiled at me, but there was something wrong with her eyes. They were empty, like the woman's. Hollow. I don't know what happened to me that night. I don't know how much time has passed since then. But now, every time I close my eyes, I hear her whispers. I hear her calling my name. And I know, deep down, that I'll never escape. The house on Ravens Hill has claimed me, and it's waiting for you too. Second story. The shadows beneath Elm Street. I had never been a superstitious person, but when I saw the old house at the end of Elm Street, something in the back of my mind whispered that I should have stayed far, far away. The house was ancient, sitting like a dark sentry at the edge of town. Its windows broken and the wooden frame sagging as though it had weathered too many storms. I remember the first time I saw it. My wife, Emily, and I had just moved to the small town of Brooksville, hoping for a fresh start after the chaos of city life. We were thrilled to find a house that was spacious, affordable, and tucked away from the noisy streets of New York. But the moment I saw that house, I had an uneasy feeling in my gut, an instinct I couldn't ignore. Emily, on the other hand, was more curious than concerned. "It's just an old house," she had said, trying to reassure me. Maybe it's just waiting for someone to give it some love. But I could never shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The house had been abandoned for years, but there was something about it that didn't feel empty. It was as though it still had a presence, a heartbeat that pulsed through its rotting walls. One evening, after settling into our new home, I decided to take a walk. It was then that I noticed something strange. The house seemed to call to me, not in a way that was loud or overt, but in a way that tugged at my soul. I couldn't explain it. I just felt an overpowering need to go inside. Against my better judgment, I walked up the path, the rusted gate creaking open as if it had been waiting for me. I felt a cold chill rush down my spine, but curiosity pushed me forward. The door to the house was ajar, as if someone had been expecting me. Inside, the air was thick, stale with years of neglect. The floorboards groaned under my feet as I ventured deeper into the darkness. There was a strange smell, like wet earth and something far older, something I couldn't quite place. I moved cautiously, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The silence was deafening, save for the faint, rhythmic tapping that seemed to echo from somewhere upstairs. I didn't know what drew me up there. It was like an invisible force guiding me, pulling me further into the belly of the house. The stairs creaked as I ascended, and with each step, the air grew colder. I reached the top of the stairs and found a long hallway. At the end, there was a door, slightly cracked open, as if inviting me in. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob. The room was empty, save for a large, dusty mirror hanging on the wall. I stepped closer, my reflection distorted in the cracked surface. But something was wrong with the reflection. My face wasn't mine. It was a twisted version of myself, pale and hollow, eyes darkened and sunken. I blinked, and the reflection blinked with me, but when I opened my eyes again, it didn't. I staggered backward, my heart pounding in my chest. But before I could turn to flee, a voice whispered in my ear, cold and sharp, "You shouldn't have come." I spun around, but no one was there. I ran out of the room, down the stairs, and out the door. The world outside felt like a distant dream as I stumbled away from the house, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. Emily was waiting for me when I got home, concern written on her face. I tried to explain what happened, but she just shook her head. "It's an old house, honey," she said softly. "You were probably just imagining things. You're tired, that's all." But I knew deep down that something had followed me back. Something had attached itself to me, and it wasn't going to let go. The nightmares began the following night. They were vivid, relentless, and terrifying. I would wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, as though I had just been running for my life. And every time I closed my eyes, the mirror in that room flashed in my mind, its twisted reflection haunting me, mocking me. Days turned into weeks, and Emily grew more distant. She wasn't the same. Her eyes had lost their spark, and she seemed to be looking through me, as if I wasn't really there. I tried to talk to her, but she would only stare at me in silence, her face pale and drawn. One night, I woke up to the sound of whispers. I couldn't tell where they were coming from, but they seemed to surround me. Panic gripped my chest as I turned to Emily, but she wasn't in bed. I rushed through the house, calling her name, my voice hoarse with fear. The whispers grew louder, and then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps in the attic. I grabbed a flashlight and rushed up to the attic, my heart hammering in my chest. As I reached the top of the stairs, I saw her. Emily. She was standing in front of the mirror in the attic, her back to me, her face twisted in an expression I had never seen before. Empty, cold, and distant. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. Slowly, I stepped toward her, and when I reached out to touch her shoulder, she turned around. Her eyes were black, completely black, and the corners of her mouth twisted into a grin that sent a wave of pure terror crashing through me. And then, in a voice that wasn't hers, she whispered, "You should have stayed away." The room seemed to close in around me, and I felt the weight of something ancient, something evil, pressing down on me. It was too late to escape. I had opened the door. I had invited it in. And now it had taken everything. I woke up in a hospital, disoriented and alone. The doctors told me I had suffered a breakdown, that I had been found wandering the streets, mumbling about a house. But I knew the truth. The house hadn't let me go, and it never would. The last thing I remember was hearing a faint whisper in the dark, "You belong to us now." Fourth story, the hollow walls of Raven's Grove. The moment I stepped inside the house, something felt wrong. It was as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for me. The house in Raven's Grove had been on the market for months, and despite the strange rumors floating around the small town, I saw no reason not to take it. It was cheap, too cheap perhaps. But in my mind, that was a blessing. My wife, Emily, and I had just moved to this town, seeking a fresh start, and the price was right. The realtor didn't mention much about the house's past, just that it had been sitting vacant for several years. The house was massive, almost too large for just the two of us. The dark wood floors creaked underfoot, the walls seemed to stretch endlessly, and the high ceilings loomed like the empty sky. There was a chill in the air, even though the heater was running. Emily seemed unfazed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The first night was uneventful, or so I thought. But as the days went on, strange things began happening. At first, it was small. A light flickering on and off in the hallway, a door that would mysteriously open and close by itself, whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. I tried to rationalize it. Old houses creak, lights go out, the wind makes strange noises. But then I saw something. It was a shadow, a dark figure that moved against the light of the hallway. At first, I thought it was Emily, but when I called her name, there was no answer. I rushed to the living room, only to find her asleep on the couch, looking peaceful. My heart raced, my mind spinning with questions. Was I seeing things? Was it stress from the move? But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. One night, I woke up to a loud banging sound from upstairs. I jolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest. I hesitated, then grabbed a flashlight and made my way upstairs. The house was silent, except for the sound of my breathing. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard it again, a low, rhythmic thumping. It was coming from the attic. The attic door was locked. I had never tried to open it before, but now it felt like I had no choice. I grabbed a crowbar from the garage and pried the door open. The darkness inside was suffocating. I took a step forward, my breath catching in my throat, and then I saw it. There was something in the corner of the attic. It was covered in dust and cobwebs, but it was unmistakable. A large, ornate mirror. It hadn't been there the day before. I stumbled back, my eyes never leaving it. There was something wrong about it. It felt as though it was pulling me in, as if it was calling to me. That's when I heard her voice. Help me. It was soft, faint, like a whisper carried on the wind. I froze, trying to make sense of it. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, my body on high alert. Emily? I whispered, my voice shaking. But no, it wasn't her. The voice was coming from the mirror. I didn't understand. I had to get out of there. But something kept me rooted to the spot. The reflection in the mirror was shifting. The room in the mirror wasn't the attic. It was a room I didn't recognize. Dimly lit, with walls covered in strange markings. A room that felt wrong. It was as though the mirror wasn't reflecting the attic at all, but something else entirely. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the stairs, and slammed the attic door shut behind me. I ran down the hallway, my mind racing. What had I just seen? I couldn't explain it, but I knew one thing for sure. The house wasn't just old. It was something else, something darker. I told Emily about the mirror, but she didn't believe me. She thought it was just stress too, that I was imagining things. But things only got worse. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. At night, I would hear the sound of footsteps above us, as though someone was walking around in the attic. But every time I checked, the attic was empty. Then it happened. One evening, Emily was gone. She'd gone out to meet a friend in town, leaving me alone in the house. I didn't think much of it at first. I was used to the silence. But as the hours passed, I began to feel trapped. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I heard the footsteps again, this time directly above me. But this time, there was something different, something far more menacing. I tried to ignore it, to go about my business, but the pressure was unbearable. And then the attic door burst open on its own. I grabbed the crowbar again, my hands shaking as I made my way to the stairs. I had to know. I had to see what was happening. The attic was just as I had left it, dark, silent, the air thick with an unnatural heaviness. But then something shifted. The mirror was no longer in the corner. It had moved. Now, it was directly in front of me, standing like a monolith in the center of the room. And inside it, I saw her, Emily. But she wasn't the Emily I knew. Her eyes were wide, terrified, pleading. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. She was trapped inside the mirror. And behind her, I saw something else. Something far darker, something that shouldn't have been there. A figure, a silhouette, tall and twisted, its features obscured by shadow. It reached for Emily. I screamed, but it was too late. The mirror shattered. The world around me distorted, twisted, and everything went black. I woke up outside in the front yard with no memory of how I got there. The house was silent. Too silent. I rushed inside, calling Emily's name, but there was no answer. The house was empty. The rooms, once filled with life, were now hollow, as though they had never been occupied. I searched for hours, but there was no sign of her. And then I found it, the mirror, shattered on the floor of the attic. But there was something different. I saw it then, the reflection in the broken glass. It was me. But I wasn't alone. Emily stood behind me, her eyes empty, her mouth twisted in a silent scream. The house had taken her, and now it was coming for me. Fifth story. The Haunting of Fernbrook Manor. It was supposed to be the start of something fresh. A new life, a fresh beginning. That's what my wife Amelia and I thought when we found Fernbrook Manor. A charming old house on the outskirts of Willow Creek, a sleepy little town in Ohio. No one ever bothered us. The house stood there, alone but inviting, like it was waiting for us. I still remember the first day we stepped foot inside. It was cold. Not the cold of the weather, but something deep, something old, lurking within the walls. We had been married for 3 years, and Fernbrook was the perfect place to settle down, away from the chaos of the city. The rooms were spacious, with high ceilings and old wooden floors that creaked underfoot, as if the house was whispering secrets. The garden out front was overgrown, wild with weeds, but there was something oddly beautiful about it. We spent days clearing the yard, trying to bring some life back to the place. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. At night, things changed. The house seemed to shift, groan under its own weight. It was subtle at first, just small noises, the distant sound of footsteps when no one was there, the flickering of lights that came and went without explanation. Amelia brushed it off, insisting it was just the house settling. Old homes do that. But I wasn't so sure. I started to notice things, strange shadows in the corners of my vision, fleeting glimpses of figures that vanished when I turned to face them. At night, I would hear whispers, faint voices, too soft to understand, but there, always there, like they were calling me. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild. Then came the dreams. They started innocently enough, Simple images of the house as it had once been, a bustling home filled with laughter and warmth. But as the nights wore on, they grew darker. The laughter twisted into screams, the warmth turned into unbearable heat. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. Amelia didn't understand, thought it was just stress from moving. She suggested I see a doctor, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with this place. One evening, after Amelia had gone to bed, I stayed up, staring out of the window, lost in thought. That's when I saw it. In the garden, by the old oak tree, a figure stood, tall, dark, and shrouded in a tattered coat. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge my presence. It just stood there, watching. I wanted to call out to warn Amelia, but my voice caught in my throat. I could only watch, helpless, as the figure vanished into the darkness. The moment it was gone, the whispers returned. But this time, they weren't distant. They were close, too close. I could hear them in the walls, in the floorboards beneath my feet. The following day, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I dug into the history of Fernbrook Manor, searching through old town records, local legends. What I found chilled me to the bone. The house had once belonged to the Fernbrook family, who had vanished under mysterious circumstances nearly a century ago. The last known occupants were said to have died in a fire, except the fire had never been officially acknowledged, and the bodies were never found. It wasn't just the fire that troubled me, though. The town's history was riddled with disappearances, with strange deaths tied to the house. Every family that moved in was never seen again. Their names lost to time, their fates sealed in silence. And the whispers, they weren't just a figment of my imagination. They were real, tied to the house, to the land beneath it. I tried to confront Amelia with what I had learned, but she wouldn't listen. She was too attached to the house, too convinced that we had made the right choice. She told me I was overreacting, that it was just an old house with a spooky history. But I knew there was something in the house, something dark and ancient that was watching, waiting. That night, the whispers became louder, more insistent. I couldn't sleep. I wandered through the house, drawn to the attic, a place I had always avoided. The door creaked open, and I stepped into the dimly lit room, the air thick with dust. In the center of the room, a large antique mirror stood, its surface cracked and stained. But it wasn't the mirror that caught my attention. It was what I saw in it. Amelia. But she wasn't standing in the attic with me. No, she was standing in the reflection, her eyes wide, her face pale. And she wasn't alone. Behind her, a shadow loomed, tall and menacing. It reached for her, its fingers long and twisted. I tried to shout, to warn her, but no sound came from my mouth. The reflection shifted, and suddenly Amelia was gone. I turned, heart racing, to find her standing in the doorway, looking at me with a confused expression. She didn't know what I was talking about. She didn't see the shadow. She didn't see what I had seen. But I knew that something had taken her. The house wasn't just haunted, it was a trap. And now, I was its next victim. I didn't stay long after that. I fled, but as I left, I could hear the whispers follow me, growing louder, filling my mind. Amelia's face was the last thing I saw as I looked back at the window of Fernbrook Manor, her eyes hollow, her mouth moving silently. I ran, but I know now that it was too late. The house doesn't let go, and neither does the darkness that lives inside it. Sixth story. The Haunting of Maple Ridge. I remember the first time I saw it. The house. It wasn't anything special at first glance. Old, a little rundown, nestled at the end of a cul-de-sac in Maple Ridge, a small town in the middle of nowhere. The kind of place where people smiled at you from across the street, but you knew better than to ask too many questions. It was late in the fall when we moved in. The air had that crisp bite to it, and the trees had begun shedding their leaves, leaving behind a skeletal landscape. My wife, Emily, was excited. She had always dreamed of living in a house with character, something with history. I, on the other hand, had my doubts, but I kept them to myself. There was something unsettling about the place, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was just the isolation, or maybe it was the way the house seemed to watch us, even as we unpacked. The first night we stayed there, I couldn't sleep. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and I heard strange creaks and groans as if the house were alive. Emily, exhausted from the move, slept soundly beside me, but I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening. Then I heard it, a whisper, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves, but then clearer. It was a voice, malevolent, low. I strained my ears to listen. "It's not safe here," the voice murmured. I shot up, heart pounding in my chest. Emily stirred, but didn't wake. I looked around the room, but there was nothing there, just the empty silence of the old house. I told myself it was just the wind, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the feeling of being watched never went away. Every corner seemed darker than it should be, every shadow more menacing. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences escalated. Objects would be moved from one place to another, without explanation. A picture frame I'd left on the mantel would be found on the floor. The radio would turn on by itself, static filling the room like the sound of 1,000 whispers. Emily tried to brush it off, but I could see the unease in her eyes. We both knew something wasn't right, but neither of us were brave enough to confront it head on. Then came the night that changed everything. I was downstairs in the kitchen when I heard Emily's voice upstairs, calling me. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. She had been in the attic earlier, cleaning out some old boxes. But her voice, it wasn't her. It was distorted, as if someone or something was trying to mimic her. I ran upstairs, my feet pounding against the hardwood floors. The house seemed to grow colder with each step I took. As I reached the attic, the door creaked open by itself. There, in the dim light, I saw her. Emily was standing by the window, her back to me. But something was wrong. Her posture was stiff, unnatural. I called her name. "Emily?" She didn't respond. Instead, she slowly turned toward me, her face pale, her eyes wide and empty like two dark voids. The air around us grew heavy, thick with an oppressive force. And then she smiled, a smile that wasn't hers. It twisted, jagged, as though the face she wore wasn't truly hers to begin with. "Welcome home," she said, but the voice was no longer hers. The walls seemed to close in around me as I backed away, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't know what was happening. Was it her? Or was it something else? Something that had taken her, that had become her? In a panic, I grabbed her by the arm, shaking her, trying to snap her out of whatever trance she was in. But the moment my fingers touched her skin, I felt it. Cold, freezing like ice. And then she was gone. Vanished, as though she had never been there at all. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The room was empty, silent. But I could feel the presence in the air, the thing that had been watching us since we first stepped foot in the house. I couldn't stay there any longer. I had to leave. But as I turned to run, I heard it again, the whisper. Louder this time, more insistent. "You'll never leave." I don't remember how I got out of the house. I don't remember much after that. Only that I found myself standing in the front yard, shaking, looking back at the house. The windows, once dark, now gleamed with an unnatural light. And I knew, without a doubt, that the house had claimed me, just as it had claimed Emily. I ran far, but no matter how far I went, the whispers never stopped. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when I close my eyes, I can still hear them. They're calling me back. They're waiting. And now, The house waits for anyone foolish enough to wander too close to its doors. Seventh story, the shadows of Langford House. I moved into Langford House just a week ago, a seemingly charming property nestled on the edge of the sleepy town of Belvoir, New Jersey. The house was old, yes, but it had character. A little too much character, if you ask me. The kind of character that doesn't just sit silently, it speaks in ways you don't quite understand. I remember the first night I arrived. The sun had already set, and as I unpacked, I couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. The house was cold despite the heater running full blast, and the silence was overwhelming. Even the crickets outside seemed to be holding their breath. But the real unease crept in when I noticed something odd in the corner of the living room. An old, full-length mirror. It was ornate, covered in dust, and almost out of place with the rest of the house's more rustic charm. I thought it was just a relic of the previous owners, nothing more than a forgotten decoration. But the first time I looked into it, I saw something. Or rather, someone. For a split second, I thought I saw the reflection of a man standing behind me. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit, his face obscured by the shadows. My heart raced as I whipped around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the dust particles swirling in the dim light. Shaking it off, I moved to my bedroom, hoping to find some rest. But as I lay there, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hall outside. Slow, deliberate steps, too heavy to be the house settling. I wasn't alone. I froze, holding my breath, waiting for the sound to pass. But it didn't. It stopped just outside my door. I tried to rationalize it. It had to be the house settling. Maybe it was just the wind pushing against the windows. But the footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right outside my door. I couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. And then, in a whisper too soft to be real, I heard it. Leave this place. The next few days were a blur of unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that every time I turned a corner, something or someone was just out of sight. The mirror in the living room remained, and each time I looked into it, the shadow of that man seemed to be closer. And it wasn't just the mirror. I saw him out of the corner of my eye, lurking in the shadows of the hallway, in the reflection of the windows at night. His presence grew stronger, more insistent. I decided to leave, but something strange happened. The door wouldn't open. I yanked and pulled, desperate to escape, but the handle wouldn't budge. I turned back, my mind racing. The man was there again, his figure now clear in the mirror. He wasn't just a shadow anymore. His features were unmistakable. He was grinning, and in his hand he held a key, one that looked strangely familiar. The mirror, I realized. The mirror wasn't just a mirror. It was a portal, a gateway. The man, whoever he was, wasn't a part of this world. He was a lingering echo, trapped in a place between life and death. My body trembled as I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed the nearest thing, a glass vase, and hurled it at the mirror, shattering it into 1,000 pieces. But the man didn't disappear. His reflection remained, his grin widening as the shards of glass fell to the floor. And then the room went silent. The oppressive air lifted, and for a moment I thought I was free. But when I looked down, my hand was holding something, a small, rusted key. The same key that had appeared in the man's hand. I never left Langford House. It wasn't the house that was haunted, it was me. And the man? He was always there, always watching, always waiting for me to unlock the final door. The key was the key to my own undoing. And now, it's only a matter of time before I unlock it. Eighth story, the house on Crescent Hill. I had always dreamed of finding a home that was quiet and secluded, somewhere I could escape the noise of the world. When I found it, a charming old house nestled on Crescent Hill, I thought my dream had finally come true. The house was just what I wanted, A big Victorian-style mansion with tall, creaky windows and ivy crawling up its sides. The kind of house that whispered secrets in the night. The kind of house you could imagine having been a part of history. The realtor, a thin man named Derek, had seemed eager to sell it. His eyes darted nervously as he handed me the keys, and there was something odd about his smile, like he knew something I didn't. "It's all yours now, Miss Taylor. Just be careful with the basement. And the attic," he added, almost in a whisper. I didn't think much of it at the time. The excitement of owning a new home clouded any suspicions. As soon as I walked in, the air smelled of old wood and dust. It was perfect, just like I had imagined. But from the very first night, I knew something was wrong. I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, unnaturally so. The kind of silence that felt like something was lurking just out of sight, waiting. As I lay in bed, I heard soft footsteps from upstairs. I froze, my heart hammering. I had checked every room when I moved in. There was no one else here. The footsteps continued for hours, tapping lightly against the floorboards. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way up to the second floor. As I reached the top of the stairs, the sound stopped, but the air around me felt heavier, like something was watching, waiting. I slowly approached the door to the attic. The door was old, painted a faded white with a rusty lock on it. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years. My heart raced as I reached for the handle. The second my fingers brushed the cold metal, the house groaned, loudly, as though something was trying to push back against me. With one quick twist, I opened the door. The attic was small, dusty, filled with old boxes and furniture covered in moth-eaten sheets. But there was something in the corner that caught my eye. A mirror, tall, antique, with an intricate gold frame. It seemed out of place among the clutter. I walked towards it, my breath shallow, my mind clouded with unease. As I stared at the mirror, I felt an odd sensation. My reflection wasn't quite right. It was darker, as though the light in the attic was bent around it, casting shadows where there shouldn't be. And then I saw it, a figure standing just behind me, reflected in the glass. I spun around, but no one was there. My pulse raced as I slowly turned back to the mirror. The figure was gone, but the reflection of the room, my room, was different. The walls were cracked, the windows shattered, and standing in the doorway was a woman. She was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, her hair black and wild, her eyes hollow, staring at me. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat, but when I looked again, the reflection had changed. The woman was now standing in the corner of the attic, staring at me, her mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. Suddenly, a cold hand brushed against my shoulder. I whipped around, but there was no one there. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and I could see my breath fogging in the air. I bolted down the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest, but the house seemed to stretch endlessly before me. No matter how fast I ran, I couldn't find the front door. The walls seemed to close in, trapping me inside. I tried the windows. They wouldn't open. The air grew thick with the sound of whispers, growing louder and more frantic, as if the house itself was speaking to me. And then, through the whispering, I heard a voice, deep and cold, like it was coming from the very walls themselves. "You're not supposed to leave." I turned, my blood running cold. The woman from the mirror stood in front of me, her eyes now completely black, her smile twisted into something unnatural. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She was all around me, her presence suffocating. And then everything went black. The next morning, the house was empty. No sign of me remained. The neighbors said they never saw anyone move in at all. But every so often, when the wind howls through Crescent Hill, they say they hear faint footsteps coming from the old house. And when they pass by at night, the attic window is always lit, though no one is ever seen inside. They say the house is alive, and once you're inside, it doesn't let you go. Ninth story, the house on Heather Ridge. It was a rainy night when I first saw it. The house, standing alone at the end of a winding, overgrown road, seemed to breathe in the storm. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and something else, something old, like decay. My name is Noah Stevens, and I just moved to this sleepy town of Woodbridge, somewhere in the backwoods of Connecticut. A place so quiet even the birds didn't sing. The locals had warned me. They spoke in hushed tones whenever the topic came up, shifting their gazes to the ground. They all seemed to know about the house on Heather Ridge, but none would tell me why. Of course, that made me even more curious. The first time I stepped inside, it felt like something was watching me. A chill that no amount of heat could touch. The house itself was stunning, its towering architecture something out of a forgotten time. The windows were grimy, the door heavy and old, but it held an odd charm, like it was calling me, beckoning me to unravel its mysteries. I decided to stay the night. After all, it was just a house, right? People live in houses all over the world, and they don't go crazy. Not usually. The night began like any other. The wind howled outside, tapping against the walls, making the house creak in protest. But then I heard it. A soft whisper, like the faintest breath against my ear. I froze, heart racing. I was alone, or so I thought. I turned toward the staircase that led to the second floor. The stairs groaned under some invisible weight. I didn't want to go upstairs, but my legs moved before I could think. It was like the house was pulling me, urging me toward something. Upstairs, the hall was long, shadowy, the floorboards barely making a sound beneath my feet. At the end of the hall stood a door slightly ajar, as if waiting for me. I pushed it open, the hinges protesting with a shrill squeal. Inside was a small room, the walls lined with old portraits, faces I didn't recognize, all staring at me with vacant eyes. There was a mirror too, leaning against the far wall. I don't know why, but it drew me in. Maybe it was the way the candlelight reflected off the glass. I approached it cautiously, my breath fogging up the cool surface. The reflection wasn't mine. At first, I thought it was the poor lighting, but no, there, behind my reflection, was a figure, a shadow. A man, tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes and a smile that sent a shiver down my spine. I spun around, but no one was there. My heart raced as the air grew heavy, almost suffocating. Suddenly, I heard the sound of footsteps from behind me. Slow, deliberate steps that echoed in the otherwise silent house. I turned back to the mirror. The figure was still there, but now he was closer, so close I could feel his breath. My blood ran cold. I ran, blindly, through the maze of rooms, stumbling over furniture, my mind a blur of fear. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the house itself was speaking to me. It was saying something I couldn't understand, but the dread in my chest only grew. I made it to the front door, but it wouldn't open. The handle twisted in my hand, but the door remained shut as if it were mocking me. Suddenly, the whispering stopped, dead silence. Then a voice, clear and deep, echoed through the room. "You shouldn't have come." I spun around, but again, I was alone. My hands were shaking, my head spinning. What was happening? Was I losing my mind? I didn't wait to find out. I broke the window with a nearby chair and crawled out into the night, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran and didn't stop until I reached the safety of my car. As I drove away, I looked back at the house one last time. The lights flickered in the windows, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the reflection in the rearview mirror. There in the back seat, sitting quietly, was the figure from the house, his hollow eyes staring at me, his lips stretching into that same unsettling grin. That night, I left Woodbridge. I've never gone back to that house. but I still hear the whispers. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see his eyes staring back. 10th story, the shadows in the walls. It was supposed to be the start of a new chapter in my life. My husband Jake and I had just bought our first home in the quiet town of Silverbrook, a small, picturesque place tucked away in the hills of Connecticut. The house, a sprawling 2-story Victorian, was old, yes, but there was something undeniably charming about it. The moment we walked through the front door, I felt it. The weight of something unspoken. But I brushed it off. After all, we were starting fresh. A new home, new memories, new beginnings. The first few nights were fine. Jake and I settled in, unpacking boxes and cleaning. But there was this faint sound that kept me awake at night. A soft scratching, like something was moving behind the walls. I asked Jake about it, but he just shrugged it off. "Old houses make noises," he said, his voice comforting. "It's nothing to worry about." But it wasn't just the scratching. There were whispers, too. Low murmurs that echoed through the halls, just out of reach. At first, I thought it was the wind. But then the wind began to carry voices. Faint, unintelligible, but unmistakable. I told Jake, but his smile faltered. "You're just stressed, babe," he said, kissing my forehead. "You'll get used to it." But I didn't. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. Some nights, I'd wake up to find my own name being called softly, almost lovingly, from the darkness. It was always the same voice. Calm, soothing, but eerily familiar. One afternoon, I was in the attic, going through old boxes, when I found something strange. It was a dusty old journal, its pages yellowed with age. I opened it, and the first thing that struck me was the name written in delicate script, Sarah Whitmore. The date on the first entry was from 1902. I began to read. The journal spoke of a woman named Sarah, a young bride who had moved into this very house with her husband. They, too, had bought the house in search of a fresh start. But as Sarah wrote, her words grew more frantic with each entry. She spoke of hearing whispers in the walls, of being watched by unseen eyes, and of strange figures that appeared in the shadows. The more I read, the more I felt a chill crawl up my spine. In the final entry, Sarah wrote about a terrible decision she had made. "The house is alive," she wrote, "and it wants me. I must leave before it takes me completely." I closed the journal, my hands trembling. That night, the whispers returned, louder than ever. But this time, they weren't whispers. They were voices, clear as day, speaking in unison. Leave, before it's too late. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I told Jake about the journal, about Sarah Whitmore. His face drained of color, and he looked at me as though I had just spoken in another language. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice shaking. I showed him the journal, but when he touched it, his face went pale. He backed away slowly, his eyes wide. "This house? It's cursed," he whispered, his voice trembling. We shouldn't have bought it." I didn't understand. "What do you mean?" Jake wouldn't explain, but he became distant, his eyes hollow, as if he were seeing something I couldn't. The scratching in the walls grew louder, and the whispers became a constant and oppressive presence in the house. One night, as I lay in bed, I felt a cold breeze sweep through the room. The air became thick, suffocating. I looked around, but there was nothing, just darkness. But then, I saw it. A figure in the corner of the room, standing just out of sight. It was tall, its outline blurred, its features obscured. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and lifeless. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. My body wouldn't move. It was as if I were paralyzed, trapped in my own skin. The figure stepped closer, its footsteps silent on the wooden floor. It leaned in, its breath hot and fetid against my ear. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered. I fought to move, to scream, but it was too late. I felt the presence wrapping around me, its cold tendrils tightening around my chest. And then, as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. The next day, Jake was gone too. He hadn't left a note, hadn't said a word, just vanished. I searched the house, calling his name, but there was no answer, only the whispers. The house had taken him, and it wanted me next. The days blurred together after that. The house seemed to warp around me, its walls shifting, its floors creaking as though something was alive inside. I knew I had to leave, but the house wouldn't let me. Every time I tried to escape, I found myself back inside, as if the doors and windows led to nowhere. Then one night, I heard something different, something that made my heart stop. It was my name being called from downstairs. I rushed down to find Jake standing in the hallway, his eyes wide and empty. "It's not real," he whispered. "You're not real." I reached for him, but when I touched his arm, it was ice cold, as if he were made of stone. His body crumbled to dust in my hands. The house had taken him, and now it was coming for me. I tried to run, to escape, but the walls closed in. I could feel it, the house wrapping its arms around me, pulling me into the dark. I could hear the whispers now, louder, clearer, saying the same thing over and over. "You should have left." And as I was consumed by the darkness, I realized the truth. There was no escape. The house never let anyone leave. Not Sarah. Not Jake. Not me. The house had claimed us all, and now it would wait for the next foolish soul to fall into its grasp. The shadows in the walls would never let us go.